Eel Marsh House, Wilding Hall, Hundreds Hall, Calaspe, Cold Thistle House, Cliff End, 124. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt,
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the first episode of Season 4, and we are so grateful to be starting our fourth season. And just so you know, this particular episode, and actually the next few ones that we're going to be doing, are kind of us looking back and reflecting a little bit and revisiting some of our earlier topics from different angles and perspectives. So this particular episode's theme is going to be haunted houses, which might strike you as familiar if you're a long-time listener or have gone back and picked things up. But it's going to take the focus of haunted houses from women writers and female perspectives. So I do want to back up, though, and just say, wow, Season 4. Wow. Did either of you think that 4 years ago that we'd still be doing this, that we'd actually, that the podcast would survive?
You know what? I think I was surprised when we made it to episode 4. So I think coming to season 4 and having it come out consistently, if you count our Patreon episodes too, we've been doing essentially one episode a week for 4 years. And I'm pretty proud of that. I'm pretty proud of the work we've done here. So yeah, it shocks me, all the time.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I think I figured that we could keep going because we just enjoy doing this so much. What shocks me is the passage of time. Like, it doesn't feel like we've been doing this 3 full years and starting on a fourth.
No, it certainly doesn't feel like that to me either. And I know I sent out a tweet about this when we, when the No Fear Cast Twitter account was mentioning our beginning for our fourth season. I sent out my own kind of personal tweet from my own account, and it was just like, one thing that I'm, of course, so grateful for is all the listeners, which, like, when we were starting on episode 1, 2, 3, probably that whole first season, it shocked me that people would be finding us and listening to us that weren't just friends and family. Not that I think that we have nothing to say, but it's one of those imposter syndrome things, I guess, where it's like, well, who would want to listen to us? But I don't want to sound arrogant either, because really at the end of the day, like, I think you're right, Mel, we would still be doing this if we had 5 listeners instead of the amount that we have now. But the fact that we do have listeners, and the fact that you guys do send us emails and reach out to us on social media, like, that's probably the coolest part of all this to me. Like, we're not making any money off of this thing. It's totally a labor of love. Like, we're not really generating profit or anything, but we still have day jobs. But, like, the fact that you are out there listening to us every time we put this stuff out and downloading it or streaming it from wherever you're getting it, and like, that's just, it's almost humbling, like, I think that's a good word. Like, thank you all. Just thanks for listening, like, truly.
No, absolutely. Yeah, this is I mean, you hear the words passion project thrown around a lot. But it does mean something. It's something special, I guess. I don't have the words right now for it, but when you do something that you love and you do something that you're passionate about, and then you get to share it with other people, and you get to see that other people are passionate about the same things, that is a wonderful feeling. And I know that, I mean, in anybody's life, you have kind of ups and downs, and certainly the world has kind of felt off kilter at times recently. But it's just nice. It's nice to know that there is a community out there. It's nice to know that I have great co-hosts and good listeners. So yeah, I'm with you on that, Matt. Thank you, everybody. Well, should we jump into haunted houses now that we've got all the feels out of the way?
Now that we've thanked everybody. And sure, yeah.
So Mel, you read off some haunted houses, or I guess we can call them famous haunted houses. We didn't mention Hill House since we've come off of a very long summer talking about Hill House, but these are some other ones.
We've exhausted Hill House.
We have exhausted Hill House. So all of these have in common that they are, rather hellish houses, or kind of the bad place, if you want to call it that. These are bad places that are all written by women. And Matt, you had mentioned that our very first series when we started this in season 1 was on the haunted house. And, we talked about like the fall of the House of Usher, the turn of the screw. I think we talked about Beloved a little bit. We talked about a few other ones. So we wanted to kind of come around to this and look specifically at a different angle. In this case, the ones that are written by women. So before we jump into this, I'm going to quiz you guys a little bit. To see if you know which houses go with which books. All right. So when I say Eel Marsh House, do you recognize that one?
Oh, I do.
Well, go ahead. But you buzzed first.
Yes. The Woman in Black.
Right. The Woman in Black. Okay. Hundreds Hall.
I'm buzzing again. The Little Stranger.
The Little Stranger. Okay. Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. 1, 2, 4.
Ooh. I got that one.
Okay, you got that one.
That's Beloved.
That is Beloved.
That's an easy one though.
Yeah. So all of these are written by women. Just the other. We won't play this game forever. I'll say the other ones are Wilding Hall, of course, by Wilding Hall by Elizabeth Hand. Calaspi was Bitter Orange by Claire Fuller. Cold Thistle House was from the Madeleine Roux series, House of Fury series. And Cliff End was Dorothy McCardle's The Uninvited, which I think, what was the original title of The Uninvited?
I think it was Uneasy Freehold.
Uneasy Freehold. That was the British release. Okay. So yeah, all written by women. And we should probably say a little bit about Toni Morrison. We are recording this on August 14th, 2019. So just shortly after she has passed. And you guys want to say anything about that? Sorry.
No, that's fine. I guess I have two things to say. One is our Patreon listeners, our $5 a month Patreon supporters are getting this week that we're recording our kind of thoughts and remembrances of Toni Morrison. And we talked a bit about Beloved in that. But I think one thing I wanted to mention is after we had recorded that, so it would have been this past Sunday, a little over a week ago for listeners listening to this when it comes out, I actually got to see the Toni Morrison documentary, The Pieces I Am, and it is excellent. And it was very emotional seeing it just, 6 days or so after she had passed away. But I recommend, if it's in a city near you, go check it out.
Yeah, I'll keep my own thoughts brief too, because like you said, we did release a mini episode entirely dedicated to a sort of, I guess, in memoriam of Toni Morrison. But she was a powerful voice and a phenomenal writer, and she was one of the greats, just period. But her use of the English language is so unique and so skillful and talented, and just such a phenomenal voice in general. So it's a sad thing, even though she was 88 years old, so it wasn't dying young suddenly, unexpectedly, but still just to lose someone of that magnitude, no matter the age or the circumstance, is still a pretty sad thing for the world, I'd say. She was definitely one of a kind.
Yes, and all her work is amazing, but 124 is just, Beloved is the epitome of the American novel, but I think it's also just the epitome of what an American haunted house novel should be or could be.
Well, since we're talking about haunted houses, and we can start with Beloved, if you want to, since we're already kind of talking about Toni Morrison. But in coming up with this list of haunted houses written by women, and there are. This is only a sampling of some of them. And, Mel, you read off, I think, 7 names. I already mentioned an 8 with Hill House. And there are so many more that we could come up with, by the time you mention, Daphne du Maurier or Anne Rivers Siddons or any of the books being written today that feature haunted houses by women. There does seem to be a lot of women who tend to write haunted houses, a lot of really iconic haunted houses that were written by women. So I want to pose a couple of questions to you guys and hear your thoughts on it. I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious to hear yours. First, why do you think women are so good in particular at writing haunted houses versus not to say that they don't write other forms of, horror, because they certainly do, but this does seem to be a trend. And do you think their houses are any different from the ones that are written by male authors, or is a haunted house a haunted house no matter what you're dealing with? I don't know. What do you guys think about?
I think there are several reasons why women have maybe been drawn to writing haunted house stories. And, it's good, I think, Lisa, to have the disclaimer that we're probably going to say a few times in this episode that women don't just write haunted house stories. They write all types of horror. And there's lots of amazing women writers of genre fiction out there, whether it's like, dark fiction, not just horror. But I think, women return over and over again to haunted house fiction in a way. And a lot of the greats that we throw around when we're talking about like classic women writers, like you mentioned, Daphne du Maurier and Shirley Jackson, Toni Morrison, these women were writing at least one, possibly more haunted house books. And often, even if it's not a haunted house story, there's a disturbed house or something dark or violent attached to a house. And I think part of this is like, I think traditionally in culture, we have identified women as being tied to houses, tied to homes, as mothers, as wives. We still do, I think, to a certain extent. I mean, things have changed, but there's all sorts of articles out there about women's, the division of labor in the home. And I think that there are a lot of disturbing things that can happen in houses that horror literature makes us look at or forces us to look at. Domestic violence, for instance, this kind of control of women in certain ways. Something you think of a book like Rebecca, where the woman is kind of so controlled or oppressed by the husband that she feels like she's kind of can't measure up to the first wife and is haunted by that first wife, kind of the competition for the man's attention. Or you think of a book like, Hundreds Hall, where it seems like the mother is taken advantage of by the haunted house in a way because of the grief over her daughter that was lost, and the daughter who isn't marrying or doing things that quote unquote women were thought that they should be doing in the 50s maybe is kind of being punished by the house. The Woman in Black, about a death of a child. Shirley Jackson has a lot of women who are kind of like, they can't pursue what they want to pursue because there's these ideas of what they should be doing. Or even when we talked about The Haunting of Hill House, the idea of different kinds of mothers and how women often feel like they can't like measure up to what we culturally think of as mothers. So I think, there's all sorts of violence, be it emotional or mental, like in something like Dorothy McCardle's The Uninvited, to actual physical violence, to sexual violence that is like inside these homes and these private spaces, and these women are trying to show that there's a lot going on in these homes that are haunting this trauma and loss. And so I'm thinking that is probably the reason why all writers keep returning to haunted houses, but maybe why women return to them over and over again. I feel like I'm kind of being general, and we'll get more specific as we get into other books, but those are just some of my thoughts.
Something that you said, I want to add to real quick, because you had said that the domestic sphere kind of belongs to women traditionally, in that, and you talked about like the domestic duties and how still even a lot of that falls to the woman, and traditionally the care of the home, the care of the children was in the woman's hands, and that was her space while I guess her husband went out and made the money. um, and I absolutely agree with you there, because I think that's something that, I mean, we're still talking about it. There are still articles today being written, even though you may have a 2-income household and 2 parents working, that the division of labor is not always equal, when it comes to things at home. But of course, I'm thinking about this from the Gothic tradition, because that's where my, I guess, scholarship lies. That's what I enjoy. So I think about it from that. And it's still held true that these spaces belong to the women. But one thing that I think is important when it comes to women writing haunted houses, and I'm thinking of some very specific novels here that we can talk about in after this, I guess. But if the domestic sphere belongs to the woman, it's still owned by the man. And it becomes something that is fought over, at least in the Gothic novels, because those took place in the late, like, some the height of the Gothic novels were like what, 1790 to 1820.
Mm-hmm.
And so around that time period in England, mainly, is where they were coming out of. Women couldn't own property. So they couldn't own a house, they couldn't own a land. And so a lot of it was, well, here's a young woman who is the only heir to her father's fortune or her father's land. And so, of course, the villain is going to come in and try to marry her, usually forcefully, so that then he can gain control over everything that she has. And so even though these spaces are, like you look at Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and she certainly is the second Mrs. De Winter is haunted by the first. There's still a lot of control being exercised over her by certain people in that house. And I think that's a lot of what lends itself. I mean, certainly we didn't really talk about it too much, but in the book Hill House, that was one of the things that was so horrible about Hugh Crane, not the TV version, again, in the book, but was the amount of control he tried to force over the women in the house. So there is that kind of push and pull where it's kind of a place of their own making, because as women, they should control the domestic realm, but it's also kind of a prison too, and a place where they're fighting for that control, because technically they don't own it in a lot of these stories. And I think that's why a lot of them we see today are set, maybe 50 years ago or further back, to kind of play up that.
No, I think, yeah, I agree. I like how you kind of extended my argument there. And, this is something that I was thinking about this. It's not a haunted house book per se, though I think you can make the argument there are haunted houses in it. But Grace Metalius's book, Peyton Place, which I think any listener of a certain age knows exactly what I'm talking about. Um, the idea of this being a hugely scandalous book in the 1950s. And if you read it, you're kind of like, well, I guess I could see how this is scandalous in the 1950s. But at the same time, it's like these are real life situations, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse of children in the home. And, at the time, and I think even now, we have this idea of like public and private. And it's like what happens in someone's home is like private. And often, victims of that sort of violence find it difficult to get help because it's like you talking about someone else. Like if the person who owns the house is committing the violence against you, how do you tell other people that this is happening? There's a lot of pain that's hidden in houses throughout history that we don't like to think about. And when writers make us think about these things, we get really angry because we like to think of the home as like home sweet home and beautiful and wonderful parental love to children. And I think one of the things that horror does, especially in these sorts of books that we're talking about tonight, is take the private and make it public in a way, like force us, something I think I mentioned in the mini episode about on Toni Morrison, like force us to not be blind to what's going on, or open something to like that unflinching gaze. It could be trauma. It could be trauma like grief or loss, like the loss of a child or the loss of a mother. But I think when there's violations, as a culture, we have this idea of, well, that's a private family matter. I don't want to know about it, or I don't want to get involved. And when writers open us up to those like gothic eruptions, we're just like, well, that's not real. I don't want to pay attention to that. I don't want to deal with that. And I think women historically have always used fiction, whether it's, supernatural or not, to talk about issues that they were facing in culture. And the issues that are connected to homes are the issues that they show us, in horror or supernatural fiction.
Yeah, as you were talking, I kept thinking about The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, and how, because you said the word violation, and because I always, that's such a strange little book, but the violation, I think of somebody like Dr. Faraday when he comes into Hundreds Hall, and
he tries to make it his, even though he has no business there. Yeah,
absolutely. And it is that insertion of himself. Like you said, I mean, yes, he has no business whatsoever being there or being with the family. And Caroline, that's the daughter's name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Carol, yeah. She seems like such a vulnerable person through a lot of the story that, I mean, it's watching a predator almost circle his prey in a really kind of sinister way. When something, yeah, I mean, the home should be hers, full stop, and it's unclear why he feels so, I guess, possessive towards it. But yeah, sinister is and kind of creepy and icky is the only way I can think of it. But I think that's a really good example of what kind of you were talking about with the idea of violation and what can happen in somebody's personal affairs and how quickly it can become a subject of horror when you cannot look away. And I think that's one thing that makes Sarah Waters a really good example of someone who could write a really effective haunted house story, because she doesn't let us look away.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And there's not much Caroline can do to get away from his machinations, whether he realizes what he's doing or not, because people will just be like, isn't it great that that someone is finally courting you and you might be married and you can go off and do something else or bring life back to the house or whatever. she can't explain to people outside the situation that he's trying to control her decisions and make her do things she doesn't want to do because she's interpreted a certain way by the people outside of the home. And something else I really love about that book is how, well, it's disturbing, but how she has the doctor basically, he becomes hysterical himself once he starts to lose power over her. And I'm not going to spoil anything, but, things get really dark then. But yeah, this idea of like, she's vulnerable because no one else is going to interpret what he's doing as not a good thing, as controlling her. They're going to see it as an opportunity for her. So she has to kind of assert herself. It's a trap. And he's not even part of the family. He's a complete outsider.
Well, and she's trapped in more ways than one, which, because really, what could she do if she didn't have the help of a suitor? The house is falling apart and she's just, sitting there with her mother, just not doing anything. And there is that idea that she almost does need a savior, but not in this way.
Right.
Which is the frustrating, I think, the frustrating. I'm trying not to say too much about this book without giving it away, which makes it difficult. Except, yeah, I love it.
Well, she spends the whole book trying to escape Hundreds Hall, and he spends the whole book trying to entrap her.
Yes.
And I don't think that gives too much away, but
which makes it's a good Gothic novel that was written recently.
Yeah, I really like that book. It's gone over well when I teach it too.
Well, you had mentioned, Mel, when you were talking, in your list of things, I guess, that could haunt women, you had mentioned, of course, these kind of violations in domestic spaces, which are typically, you're right, they are typically things that and I'm so glad you brought up Peyton Place, because it is the kind of idea, well, we don't talk about that in polite society, or, growing up, I used to always hear, well, you never know what happens behind closed doors. Just that idea that if a family is going through something, you just let them go through it. You don't interfere unless you have to. And that's what makes these stories really effective. But one of the things that you had mentioned, and I'm just going to kind of pick this word to see if we can run with it. But you had mentioned like trauma, and how trauma can haunt a family, or in some cases a house, certainly in Hill House. The trauma of what Hugh Crane did echoed throughout. And even if Hill House was like a bad place, it became even worse after a man like that lived there. But I'm curious, if a woman is writing a haunted house, how does this idea of trauma connect to it? And how do you see that? And of course, I'm thinking specifically right now of Beloved, but it fits with some of these others too.
Well, I think, and I could talk specifically about Beloved, but one of the things I think is kind of interesting to think about is, trauma of like a lot that relates between mothers and children, or loss of children or loss of a mother, seems to go through a lot of this type of fiction. One of the main hauntings in Dorothy McArdle's The Uninvited is the idea of the loss of the mother and like solving that mystery. Or, Eel Marsh House, that haunting is kind of complicated, I guess, but it all comes down to the loss of a child, and the nursery's haunted. Hundreds Hall, one of the hauntings is the loss of a child. There's so many haunted nurseries in women's haunted house fiction. But something like Beloved, I think is a kind of an exceptional example of this. I mean, when you think about trauma, and I'm not a psychologist, but when we think about trauma, just as lay people, we think of something, of course, terrible, heinous, violent happening to someone or violating someone's psyche. but it lingers, like it's difficult to work through, of course, because it's so horrible, and it plays out in different ways, or someone may reenact it in different ways, or someone may dream it, someone will have a memory of it. And a lot of times, just in the way we talk to each other, we throw around terms like ghost or haunting, when we just mean I'm haunted by this bad memory or these horrible dreams. And so one of the things that these writers are doing, and if you're thinking like Toni Morrison and Beloved, is taking these ideas of loss or horror that even if there weren't ghosts around, these people would have a very, very, very difficult time coming to terms with. But the ghost becomes almost like it's a signal or a metaphor of some sort. There's a sociologist, a scholar that I've read a lot of her work on haunting, and she talks about how ghosts just signal something that's happened to someone. The ghost doesn't even need to be real. When a ghost pops up, we just think, what happened in the past? What happened to this person? If you move into a house and you see a ghost, you think something horrible must have happened here. We automatically jump to that. And so in Beloved, Morrison has these characters who are all haunted by this ghost, but it means something different for everyone. Like every single person who sees the ghost Beloved, if you interpret her as a ghost, thinks of a specific thing that happened to them that's usually related in some way to violence or even family. So for Sethe, she's the child that she had to kill to make sure she didn't go back to slavery. She didn't experience rape and violence and the horrors of being possessed by another person. For the sister, she's the loss of the sister. For Paul D, she's the loss of, family and friends. For everyone who sees her, they all of a sudden get thrown back into this grief and loss, because even if Beloved didn't show up, they're still either forcing themselves to forget it, which means they're thinking about it to try to forget it, or they're thinking about it and remembering it and haunted by it. And then, of course, the people who are haunted are also haunted by these horrible, 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 heinous things that have happened to them, because a lot of the characters in Beloved are former slaves. And so they have that trauma as well. Which is what causes them to make certain decisions that then lead to more hauntings. And so, in some ways, you can look at like that history as the perfect metaphor for that history is a ghost, the thing that you want to ignore and you want to go away, but it's not, because it happened and it's powerful and it affects you, whether you want to look at it or not. And so I think even the other books that deal with this idea of loss of mother or child, they don't even really need the ghost to be haunted by trauma, if that makes sense. The ghosts are just signals that something really bad that needs to be dealt with happened here. And so, yeah, I think, and that's a lot of ways why ghosts are so throughout our folklore too. Why do we tell ghost stories? We tell them because something of the past was really terrible. It's just the books are giving it very specific reasons, and they're usually related to women.
One thing that I think is really interesting about when I was listening to you talk about Beloved and the kind of trauma that goes through, and it's specifically how the haunting shows up differently to different people. And how do I want to say this? It's a continuous cycle. And I think that book illustrates it really well. And a lot of times, one of the things that is so frightening, because a ghost story does want to tell the past. Because I think there's and that's always what the ghost stories, what the trouble is a lot of times people don't want to tell you what happened, right?
Right.
A lot of it is veiled in secrecy. For instance, if you look at Rebecca, there's a lot of secrecy around, don't go here, don't go there, don't ask these questions. That I think is important, because trauma is always going to bubble up, trauma from the past. And it does no good to ignore it. But in a lot of these stories, I don't want to say too much. I'm going to, because I like this. But The Woman in Black, the novel by Susan Hill. Now, this was, and I had forgotten about this. This was made into a movie with Daniel Radcliffe as the main character. and I had forgotten about it until I looked it up right before we recorded this. But I recommend reading the book, definitely. But that, along with a lot, and that's a pretty straightforward, I think, ghost story like we're used to telling. Like it feels almost like the ghost stories I used to read when I was a little girl, just the straightforward, there's something haunting, but that a lot of these times, these ghosts are malevolent.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the past playing up in front of you, like, hey, look at me, this happened. But the reason ghost stories are scary, the reason haunted houses are scary and we don't want to go into them is not just because they're bad or something bad happened there in the past, but because whatever there is actively out to hurt us. And I think when you put that into the package of trauma and look at it through that way, and I think that's what really sets, of course, Beloved apart from a lot of these, because Toni Morrison really drilled down into this to get at the root of it. But when a person or a people experience trauma, it doesn't just affect that one person or the people in the immediate area. Trauma has a ripple effect, and trauma can be generational. And, something that happened 50 years ago can still be affected. I mean, you look at something, of course, she was talking about slavery, and it's stuff that we are still talking about today in 2019. You hear politicians talking about it on the news. It's something that we're still trying to figure out, how do we get past this horrible thing that happened in our past? But that can be, as big as something like that or as small as something that happens within a family. But trauma is one of those things that it can't be hidden, and it does have its effects. And if you don't face it head on, it's going to eat you alive. And I think that's why a lot of these houses are malevolent, and why a lot of these spirits, I won't tell you what happens if you haven't read The Woman in Black, but that's just one example of a malevolent spirit that's out to hurt people. Yeah. So I do think that that's important to point out, because I think that fits in nicely with what your thoughts on Morrison's Beloved.
Oh yeah, I agree. And I mean, this isn't an episode on ghosts, but I mean, I could go on and on, I guess, about the different types of ghosts, but I think, we we were afraid, I think, of all ghosts coming back because it's a dead person that shouldn't be there, that's there. And it messes with our idea of like ontology and like what's real and what's not. But when the ghost is mean, that definitely adds something to it. And I think that the ghosts and stories mimic or mirror like the reasons why they exist. Like in something like Beloved, you have to have Beloved in some ways be malevolent, because if you think of her as the baby who was killed, then obviously she's going to be angry about what she lost and she doesn't understand. Very similarly to Seth's children who are alive, who are angry at her and don't understand because she won't tell them anything about what happened. Or the Woman in Black, we find out what happened to her. Of course, she's going to be angry. And so I think there's this idea of that kind of, like you said, like a circle maybe of violence or misunderstanding. And the ghost becomes a way to tell that story. And even at the end of Beloved, I don't believe you can spoil a Toni Morrison book, because the joy is reading the book, whether you know what's going on or not. It's not for plot. It's for seeing what she does with it. Even at the end, Beloved never goes away. And I think that's fascinating, because in our kind of American culture, we love Ghostbusters and ghost hunters, right? You got a ghost. Here's why it's happening. Do this. It won't bother you anymore. Or like the women that had that ghost hunting show on A&E several years ago, where they'd make a vortex around a tree or something and the ghost would go away and the people will be happy. Or Ghostbusters, pay us your $100. We'll trap the ghost and throw it away. You can't do that. It's going to explode. The containment unit's going to explode. Like, once you've been haunted, if you've learned something from the haunting changes, but it never goes away, because it's not like you can just make it like the past never happened. You can't like cleanse your home and say nothing ever happened here. in stories, if there's a ghost, something did happen. And sometimes, even if you reckon with it, just like life, it's still tough. There's still pain. There's still something left. There's still residue. And so I don't know. I've always found it fascinating, this idea of like, well, why can't we just contain these ghosts and get rid of them instead of trying to understand them and learn from them? And I think a lot of women writers of haunted house stories are also trying to make their characters experience something or learn something. And you can't just like bust the ghost. You can't burn the house down. Like you can't stop it because it's not going to stop. And I think that also kind of mimics, how we deal with these sorts of things in real life as well.
I still don't know if we're going to have to, by the way, circle back to this topic again. We're never going to get over haunted houses, I don't think. Maybe in like season 6 or 7, we'll come back to it. I guess I am curious, and now I want to look into it, if there is kind of a gender divide between this idea of wanting to bust the ghost and just be over and done with it versus what I tend to see in these women who are writing these haunted houses, which is, like you said, it's very rarely are the hauntings dealt with fully. I mean, even in the very famous ending to Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, whatever walked there walked alone. And you kind of go through this whole horrific experience with Eleanor, and then you realize that nothing really changed about Hill House. Hill House is standing the same as it was at the beginning, and a lot of these are the same way. The Woman in Black, Beloved, oh gosh, The Little Stranger, you never really get an end to that. I think and I don't know, maybe this is where I want to. The House Next Door, absolutely. And this is where I really want to do some studies, because I think when I think about like haunted houses that are written by men, the first one, and I know I've talked about this before, is Richard Matheson's Hell House. Mm-hmm. Which, even though that's not quite, it's not dealt with in the same way at the end of that, it feels like such a difference, because that one does not seem, it brings about a lot of trauma, but it's not the same lingering trauma haunting that you get in any of these books we've been discussing. It's just this is a bad house that was basically born over a hellmouth, or it's just it's not tied to anything that people do, and all of these things seem to be they're trauma that's brought about by either extreme racial prejudice with slavery and an institution, or the kind of a violent misogyny, this idea of men wanting to control women. And these are all ideas that you can't get over in the course of one book. Mm-hmm. Because even if they escape the haunted house, women are still going to have men trying to control their lives. We're like still... Go ahead.
Whitest for Witching, where the pure idea of like racial purity and consumption and women's body image are all melded together in a really interesting way.
Right.
I'm sorry, you made me think of that with what you were saying just then.
No, and that's a perfect example of it's kind of a haunted house. I didn't include it in this list because it's a strange haunted house, if you want to call it that. But I love that book. And that's right. Because those issues are still going to be there beyond that book, because that's something you do not get over. Hell House, as far as I know, as long as you are not a psychic who goes close to the marshes around Hell House, you're going to be fine. What is it? The Belasco House? Yeah. As long as you don't go there, you're going to be fine. But with these other ones, this is real world trauma that you can't get over just by exiting a house. I don't know if Eleanor was going to be okay, even if she never showed up at Hill House. And that, I don't know. I need to go down this train a little bit more and really kind of do some comparisons between the men and the women writing this, because I'm sure there's outliers, but that seems to be a really interesting difference between the two. And the people in Hell House, the characters in Hell House, even though they were not successful, they were definitely trying to vanquish whatever was in there. I mean, they were going to get rid of, whatever supernatural stuff was going on in that house. They just were not successful.
Oh yeah, the dude, the Dr. Montague type figure who gets everybody to go to Belasco House brings a ghost busting machine with him.
Right. Yes, I forgot about the
because
ghost
he
busting
says
machine.
he's going to destroy the evil in the house and make it fit to live in. But he doesn't. And yeah, you're right, because a Hell House is just undifferentiated and undiluted evil. A Satanist built it. I mean, you can't.
Yeah.
That's like an easy throwaway, right? Like, oh, I need an evil house. A Satanist will do stuff in it, you know? Like,
Well,
yeah.
And isn't that so interesting when you put that up against something like The Little Stranger? Because there you have a man who is going in and trying to control a house and trying to possess it and trying to get a fortune from it in the same way that the parapsychologist, I can't remember his name either, it wasn't Fisher. Fisher was the medium, right?
There was a woman medium, and Fisher was the male medium.
Well, yeah, he goes in, but yes, you're right. His whole goal is to make it livable. And
you're blowing my mind right now. Like, oh, that's such an interesting connection.
Well, I had always held Hell House up next to The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Sidons, because they're similar time periods, or I compare it to Hill House, of course, because again they were only a decade apart, and when they were
it was a response to Hill House, I think.
For sure. For sure. But yeah, I mean, that's really interesting when you see, because you're seeing them from two different perspectives. One is from the male point of view, and it's more sympathetic to that. And then one is more sympathetic to the female point of view. And I think, this is just my opinion, but that it makes it more horrific. Something like The Little Stranger lingers with me much more than Hell House does.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in Hundreds Hall and Little Stranger, the person trying to take over the house, to take over Caroline's life, is a doctor, a rational doctor, who's telling her that everything is for her own good. His name is Faraday, for goodness sakes, the scientist.
Yeah.
Who often was his ideas were used by parapsychologists. And that was kind of a little wink and a nod, I think, to this idea of the rational fighting up against something that we can't explain. I feel like Sarah Waters is writing a poltergeist story in Little Stranger. That's kind of my interpretation, but doing it in a really cool. She's dealing with hysteria and poltergeist from a woman's perspective. But I love this connection between Hundreds Hall and Hell House now. It's interesting.
Yeah. I want to explore it a little bit longer. I'm really going to have to think about this connection now, and I'm going to have to run down this rabbit hole. And like I said, maybe in a future episode, I'll be able to present a more cohesive thesis, but I think we're onto something really interesting there. In talking about that, in our first episode on haunted houses, or our first series, I guess, we tackled both real and fictional haunted houses, and we explored why they were frightening. So it's kind of a fun series if you haven't listened, to go back and listen to those. But one of the ones that we talked about was a real haunted, or I'm using air quotes that you cannot see, a real haunted house in New Jersey, that this family had bought this house, and then they had gotten these threatening letters from somebody named the Watcher. And it was so bad that they moved out of the house, this, gorgeous kind of dream home that they had bought. And we were talking about it, how we put it in the terms of, it was a domestic space that had been violated, which is a lot of these homes. We've been talking about this whole episode. But Mel, you actually came across an update about this home in New Jersey.
Yeah, I think I texted you guys a story that I found just a couple days ago. Yeah, so we talked, I think, in that episode about how horrible these letters were that were sent, so referring to their children as young blood and pointing out different things that this person had seen that had happened when they were trying to fix, do some stuff to the house and get ready to move in. I don't think they lived in it very long, if at all, even maybe. I think they've been living with one or the other of their parents for a while, actually. And apparently, there was an extensive investigation. People were questioned. It really kind of put the neighborhood in tumult. But the update is that they sold the house for, I think, I'm looking at the article that you found about it, Lisa, from CBS, for 400,000 less than they paid for it. So they sold it as a loss after 5 years of owning this house that they couldn't really live in. And let me see here, I just want to make sure I'm right about this. Yes, they sued the house's previous owner, saying that they knew about the watcher but failed to disclose it, and that was dismissed. But so apparently someone else has this house now, and hopefully it will stay out of the news. But yeah, it was like a real life kind of horror movie for these people, or kind of haunted, violated domestic space, just like you mentioned, Lisa. So I don't know. We now have an update on what happened from our very first episode.
That is a sad ending.
It is. Yeah.
It is. Well, on that note, we are again very thankful that you listeners have stuck with us, and supported us in this. So we just wanted to leave you with a reminder that I wrote a book with Mel, and it's called Monster She Wrote, and it's going to be released on September 17th. You can pre-order now by going to the Quirk Books website. If you enjoyed this discussion about haunted houses and women, there is a little section in the book that deals with something very similar, haunted spaces in the home. And I think you might enjoy it if you enjoyed this particular episode. But in the meantime, we are working on coming up with a brand new episode series. We hope you join us for that. And of course, as always, we would love to hear from you, because we love to hear from listeners. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We have a Facebook page as well, if you'd like to contact us by email. And we really do, again, love getting emails. Send us a message at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to that exclusive content. We have episodes coming out in the weeks in between our regular episodes. Of course, you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it helps other listeners like you find us. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.